The stagecoach wheels kicked up clouds of red dust as they rolled into Park City, Utah, on a scorching afternoon in July of 1882. And Julia Catherine pressed her gloved hand against her ribcage, where the bruises still ached from her stepfather's final beating 3 weeks ago. She had boarded that first train in Boston with nothing but a carpetbag, $20 sewn into her petticoat, and a marriage contract to a man named Lucas Oleander, who had advertised for a wife in the Matrimonial Times. His letter had been brief, almost curt, stating he needed a woman who could cook, keep house, and not ask too many questions, which had suited Julia just fine because she needed a man who would take her far away from Massachusetts, and the hell her life had become after her mother died. The mining town sprawled before her like a collection of wooden boxes scattered across the mountainside, buildings pressed against each other as if seeking comfort in their proximity. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys despite the summer heat, and she could hear the distant thunder of machinery from the silver mines that had given birth to this place. Men walked the dusty streets in groups, their faces hardened by labor and loneliness, and Julia felt her stomach twist with familiar fear. She had known men like these all her life, men who saw women as property to be used and discarded. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of a weathered building marked as the general store, and the driver climbed down to open the door. Julia gathered her belongings with trembling fingers, smoothing down the front of her traveling dress, which had once been a deep green but had faded to something closer to sage. She had chosen her plainest clothes for this journey, not wanting to attract attention or give Lucas Oleander any reason to think she was putting on airs. "Miss Catherine," a voice called from the boardwalk, and Julia looked up to see a man approaching. Her breath caught in her throat because he was nothing like she had imagined. Lucas Oleander stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that strained against his simple cotton shirt. His hair was dark brown, almost black, and fell past his collar in waves that suggested he cut it himself without much care for style. But it was his eyes that stopped her, a clear gray like storm clouds, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "Yes," she managed, stepping down from the coach with as much dignity as she could muster. "Mr. Oleander," he nodded once, reaching for her carpetbag before she could protest. "Welcome to Park City. I hope the journey was not too difficult." His voice was deep, but surprisingly gentle, without the harsh edge she had expected. Julia searched his face for signs of cruelty, for the tightness around the mouth that had always preceded her stepfather's rages, but found only what appeared to be genuine concern. It was long, she admitted, because lying seemed pointless. They would be married within days, and he would learn soon enough that she was not good at pretending. Lucas shifted the bag to his left hand and gestured down the street. "The parson is waiting at the church if you are willing. I know you have just arrived, but I thought you might prefer to have things settled rather than waiting in uncertainty." There it was, Julia thought with a sinking feeling in her chest. He wanted to bind her legally before she could change her mind or discover whatever flaw had prevented him from finding a wife locally. She had heard stories about mail-order brides, about the men who sent for them, about what happened when the doors closed and the politeness ended. "Of course," she said quietly, falling into step beside him. What choice did she have? She had no money for return passage, no family to take her back, nowhere else in the world to go. They walked in silence through the busy streets, and Julia noticed how people greeted Lucas with genuine warmth. A woman hanging laundry called out a hello, and an older man sitting outside the saloon raised his hand in a friendly wave. Whatever else Lucas Oleander might be, he seemed well liked in this town, which was either a good sign or evidence that he was skilled at hiding his true nature. The church was a simple white building perched on a slight rise, its steeple reaching toward the cloudless sky. Inside, the air was cooler, and Julia could smell beeswax and old wood. The parson was a thin man with kind eyes who introduced himself as Reverend Martin, and did not seem at all surprised to be conducting a wedding on such short notice. "You enter into this marriage of your own free will?" he asked Julia, and she appreciated that he looked directly at her rather than at Lucas. "I do," she said, and it was true enough. She had chosen this path, had written her own letter in response to the advertisement, had climbed onto that train with her eyes open. Lucas repeated the same vow, his voice steady, and then they were speaking the traditional words, promising to love and cherish until death. He slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, and Julia stared at it in surprise because she had not expected anything so fine. When the parson pronounced them married, Lucas did not try to kiss her, for which she was grateful. Her lips were cracked from the journey, and she could not have hidden her flinch. They signed the register, and Lucas paid the parson, and then they were back outside in the brilliant sunshine, legally bound to each other. Julia felt dizzy with exhaustion and fear, her corset suddenly too tight, the heat pressing down on her like a physical weight. "The house is about a mile from town," Lucas said, reclaiming her bag. "I have a wagon, but I thought you might like to stop at the restaurant first. You must be hungry." Julia was starving, actually, having eaten nothing but stale bread and cheese for the past 2 days, but she shook her head. "I can wait. I am sure you have work to return to." Something flickered in those gray eyes, an emotion she could not name. "I took the day off," he said simply. "My foreman can handle things." He led her to a small restaurant wedged between a barber shop and a boarding house, and Julia found herself sitting across from her new husband at a table covered with a red checked cloth. The proprietor, a cheerful woman named Martha, brought them plates of roasted chicken, potatoes, and fresh bread that was still warm from the oven. Julia tried to eat slowly, mindful of her manners, but her body betrayed her desperation. Lucas said nothing about her appetite, simply ate his own meal at a measured pace and occasionally refilled her water glass. When Martha brought out apple pie for dessert, Julia nearly wept at the kindness of it. "You mentioned in your letter that you were a foreman," she said finally, needing to fill the silence with something. "What do you oversee?" "I manage one of the silver mines," Lucas explained, setting down his fork. "The Ontario mine specifically. I have 40 men working under me, and I am responsible for ensuring they extract the ore safely and efficiently." "That sounds like dangerous work." "It can be," he admitted, "but I am careful with my men. I will not push them into situations that are unnecessarily risky, which is why the mine owner keeps me on despite the fact that I am slower than some of the other foremen." Julia absorbed this information, trying to reconcile it with her expectations. A mine foreman was a position of authority and respect, and Lucas clearly took his responsibilities seriously. It made her wonder even more why he had needed to send away for a wife. As if reading her thoughts, Lucas cleared his throat. "You are probably wondering why I placed that advertisement." She met his eyes, surprised by his directness. "The thought had crossed my mind." He was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. "I am not good with social situations," he said finally. "I spend most of my time in the mines or alone at my house. The women in town, they want someone who can dance and make conversation at gatherings, someone who fits into their social circles. I cannot be that person, and I would rather be honest about my limitations than court someone under false pretenses." There was something vulnerable in his admission that caught Julia off guard. She had expected arrogance or cruelty, not this quiet self-awareness. I am not good at social situations either, she found herself saying. I spent most of my life trying to be invisible. Lucas looked at her then, really looked at her, and Julia had to resist the urge to drop her gaze. I do not want you to be invisible, he said softly. I want you to be comfortable. The house is yours to manage as you see fit, and if you need anything, you only have to ask. They finished their meal, and Lucas paid Martha, leaving a generous tip that made the woman beam. Then they walked to where his wagon waited, a sturdy vehicle pulled by 2 patient horses. Lucas helped Julia onto the seat with surprising gentleness, his hand steady under her elbow, and then they were moving through town and out toward the open land beyond. The house appeared gradually, a low structure built of timber and stone that seemed to grow out of the earth itself. It was larger than Julia had expected, with a wide porch and glass windows that must have cost a fortune to transport. A garden grew beside it, vegetables and herbs in neat rows, and there was a well with a bucket hanging from its post. I know it is not fancy, Lucas said as he helped her down. But it is solid and warm in winter. Julia shook her head, unable to find words for what she was feeling. She had expected a shack, something barely habitable, and instead she was looking at a real home. Inside, the house was clean and simply furnished. The main room served as kitchen and living space, with a cast iron stove, a table and chairs, and a rocking chair positioned near the fireplace. Shelves lined one wall, filled with books, and Julia felt a flutter of hope. A man who read might be a man who thought, who considered the world beyond his immediate needs. The bedroom is through there, Lucas said, pointing to a door. I set up a cot for myself out here. I will not intrude on your privacy. Julia turned to stare at him. You are planning to sleep in the main room, he met her gaze steadily. Until you are comfortable with other arrangements, yes. We are married legally, but I will not force myself on you. That is not the kind of marriage I want. She had prepared herself for this moment, had resigned herself to the inevitability of the marriage bed and all its painful indignities. His words made no sense to her. But you need heirs, she managed. Sons to carry on your name. Eventually, perhaps, Lucas said quietly. But not until you are ready, not until you want it to. Julia felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. She had not cried in front of anyone in years, and she would not start now. I do not understand you. I know, he said simply, but you will in time. For now, why do not you rest? There is fresh water in the pitcher and clean linens on the bed. I need to check on the horses and do the evening chores. He left her then, stepping back outside and closing the door gently behind him. Julia stood alone in the center of the room, her carpetbag at her feet, trying to make sense of what had just happened. This was not the life she had imagined, not the prison she had resigned herself to. Lucas Oleander was not the cruel master she had expected, and she had no idea what to do with that information. Moving mechanically, she carried her bag into the bedroom and stopped in the doorway. The room was simple but beautiful, with a large bed covered in a quilt made of blues and greens, a dresser with a mirror, and a washstand. The window looked out over the garden and the mountains beyond, and Julia could see the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. She set her bag down and sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands shaking. The mattress was soft, stuffed with what felt like real feathers, and the quilt was clearly handmade, each stitch careful and even. Someone had put thought into this room, had prepared it for her arrival. Julia removed her gloves and her hat, then unbuttoned her dress with fingers that fumbled over the fastenings. She poured water into the basin and washed her face and hands, watching the dust of her journey swirl away. When she caught sight of herself in the mirror, She barely recognized the woman staring back. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins, curling wildly around her face. Her hazel eyes were huge in her pale face, shadowed with exhaustion and lingering fear. She looked like a ghost, she thought, like something not quite real. The sound of Lucas moving around outside drifted through the window, the rhythmic thunk of an axe splitting wood, the soft murmur of his voice as he spoke to the horses. Julia lay down on top of the quilt, intending to rest for just a moment, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. When she woke, the room was dark except for the moonlight streaming through the window. She sat up in confusion, disoriented, and realized she had slept for hours. Panic flared in her chest because she had duties now, responsibilities, and she had failed on her very first day. Julia stumbled out of the bedroom and found Lucas sitting at the table, reading by the light of an oil lamp. He looked up as she entered, and there was no anger in his expression, only mild concern. "I am sorry," she blurted out. "I did not mean to sleep so long. I should have made dinner. I should have—" "You were exhausted," Lucas interrupted gently. "There is nothing to apologize for. I made some soup earlier if you are hungry." He stood and moved to the stove, where a pot still sat on the warming surface. Julia watched as he ladled soup into a bowl and set it on the table with a spoon and a slice of bread. The domesticity of it was so unexpected that she found herself rooted to the spot. "Please eat," Lucas said, gesturing to the chair. "You need to recover your strength." Julia sat because she did not know what else to do and tasted the soup. It was simple but good, vegetables and barley in a rich broth. "You made this." "I have been cooking for myself for years," Lucas said, returning to his chair and his book. "I am not skilled, but I manage." They sat in silence while Julia ate, but it was not the tense, frightened silence she was accustomed to. Lucas seemed content to read, occasionally turning a page, not demanding conversation or attention. When she finished, she stood to wash the bowl, but he stopped her with a raised hand. "Leave it," he said. "I will take care of it in the morning." "But it is my job," Julia protested. "You married me to keep house." Lucas closed his book and looked at her with those steady gray eyes. "I married you because I wanted a partner, not a servant. You will contribute to this household, yes, but so will I. We will figure out how to share the work as we go." Julia had no response to that. Everything she had been taught about marriage, about a woman's place, was being turned upside down. "I do not know what you want from me," she admitted quietly. "I want you to feel safe," Lucas said. "That is the first thing, the most important thing. Everything else can wait." She studied his face, searching again for signs of deception, but found only patience. "Why?" she asked. "Why does my safety matter to you?" He was quiet for a long moment. "My mother was not safe," he said finally. "My father was a hard man, quick with his fists and his belt. I grew up watching her flinch and hide bruises and apologize for things that were not her fault. When I was 15, I swore that if I ever had a family of my own, no one would live in fear in my house. That is a promise I intend to keep." The words hung in the air between them, honest and raw. Julia felt something crack open in her chest, some small space where hope might grow. "My stepfather was the same," she whispered. "After my mother died, there was no one to protect me." Lucas nodded slowly, as if something had just been confirmed for him. "Then we understand each other," he said. "Neither of us has to be afraid anymore." They stayed up talking after that, the conversation halting at first but gradually gaining momentum. Lucas told her about the mine, about the challenges of keeping men safe underground while still meeting the owner's demands for productivity. Julia told him about Boston, about working in a textile factory after her mother's death, about the long hours and meager wages that barely kept her fed. She did not tell him about the worst of what her stepfather had done, could not bring herself to speak those words aloud, but she thought perhaps he understood anyway. When the clock on the mantel chimed 11, Lucas stood and stretched. "We should both get some rest. Tomorrow I will show you around the property, and we can go into town if you need anything from the store." Julia nodded and retreated to the bedroom, closing the door behind her. She changed into her nightgown and climbed between the sheets, which smelled of lavender and sunshine. Through the walls, she could hear Lucas moving around quietly, the creak of the cot as he settled onto it, and then silence. For the first time in years, Julia fell asleep without fear of what the morning might bring. The days that followed established a rhythm that was entirely foreign to Julia. Lucas rose before dawn to tend the animals they kept, 2 horses, a milk cow, and a small flock of chickens. He would start coffee on the stove and then head outside, moving quietly so as not to wake her. Julia began setting her internal clock to rise with him, driven by years of habit that insisted she should be the first one awake, the first one working. On the 3rd morning, she came out of the bedroom to find Lucas already preparing breakfast, eggs sizzling in a pan while he sliced bread. He glanced up as she entered and offered what might have been a smile, though it was hard to tell on his serious face. "Good morning," he said. "Coffee is ready." "You should let me do that," Julia said, moving toward the stove. "Cooking is my responsibility." Lucas stepped aside to let her take over the pan. "We can share it," he suggested. "I enjoy cooking sometimes. It helps me think." Julia flipped the eggs, watching the edges crisp and curl. "I am not used to sharing," she admitted. "I am used to having very specific duties and being punished if I fail to complete them properly." "There will be no punishments here," Lucas said firmly. "If something does not get done, we will simply do it together or leave it for another day. The world will not end if the floor is not swept or if dinner is late." It sounded too good to be true, but Julia was beginning to believe him. In the 3 days since her arrival, Lucas had not raised his voice once, had not shown any sign of the violent temper she had been bracing herself for. He moved through the house and the property with a quiet competence, doing what needed to be done without fuss or complaint. After breakfast, Lucas kept his promise to show her around. They walked the boundaries of his property, which consisted of 5 acres of relatively flat land nestled in a valley. The garden was thriving, and Lucas explained that he had learned to grow vegetables out of necessity, having gotten tired of buying expensive produce from the store. "I am not good with flowers," he admitted, gesturing to a sad-looking patch near the porch where a few scraggly plants struggled. "I tried to plant roses last year, but they all died." "Roses need very specific care," Julia said, kneeling to examine the soil. "This earth is too dry and too alkaline for them, but you might have better luck with native plants. Wild columbine grows well at this elevation, and beard tongue." Lucas looked at her with interest. "You know about gardening." "My mother loved flowers," Julia said softly. "Before she got sick, she kept a beautiful garden. She taught me everything she knew." "Then the garden is yours to do with as you please," Lucas said. "If you want to order seeds or plants, just let me know. I will provide whatever you need." They continued their tour, and Lucas showed her the barn where he kept the horses, a sturdy building that smelled of hay and leather. The horses were beautiful animals, a roan gelding named Copper and a gray mare named Silver, and they nickered softly when Lucas approached. He stroked their necks with obvious affection, speaking to them in a low, soothing voice. "You ride?" he asked Julia. "I did as a child," she said, reaching out tentatively to touch Silver's soft nose, "but it has been many years." "Silver is gentle," Lucas said. "If you would like to ride again, she would be a good mount for you. We could explore the area together when I have time away from the mine. The idea of having such freedom, of being able to ride across open land without asking permission, was intoxicating. I would like that, Julia said, and meant it. They spent the afternoon working in the garden together, weeding and watering while the sun beat down on their backs. Julia tied a bonnet over her hair and rolled up her sleeves, falling into the familiar rhythm of physical labor. Lucas worked beside her, following her instructions about which plants to thin and which to leave alone. He was a quick learner, she noticed, patient and methodical in his approach. As they worked, they talked. Lucas asked about her life in Boston, and Julia found herself sharing more than she had intended. She told him about the factory, about the other women she had worked alongside, about the supervisor who had tried to corner her in the storage room until she had broken his nose with a piece of wood. Lucas had stopped working at that, his hands still in the dirt, his face unreadable. Did he face consequences? He asked quietly. He tried to have me fired, Julia said. But the other women vouched for me, said they had seen him harassing girls before. The owner moved him to a different shift instead of dismissing him, which is as close to justice as women like us usually get. Lucas nodded slowly. I am glad you fought back. I am glad you survived. There was such genuine feeling in his voice that Julia had to look away, focusing on the tomato plant in front of her. She was not used to having her pain acknowledged, to having someone care that she had suffered. That evening, they prepared dinner together. Julia made biscuits while Lucas fried salt pork and boiled potatoes. They moved around the small kitchen with increasing ease, learning each other's rhythms, and when they sat down to eat, the conversation flowed more naturally than it had before. Tell me about the mine, Julia said as she buttered a biscuit. What is it like working underground? Lucas considered the question. It is dark and close, and you can feel the weight of the earth above you at all times. Some men find it suffocating, but I find it peaceful in a way. There are no distractions down there, nothing but the work and the men around you. You learn quickly who you can trust and who you cannot. It sounds dangerous. It is, Lucas admitted. We lose men sometimes, cave-ins or gas explosions or just plain bad luck. That is why I am careful, why I insist on proper shoring and ventilation even when the owner complains about the expense. A dead miner cannot extract ore, and I refuse to send men into situations where they are likely to die. The men must appreciate that. Some do, Lucas said. Others think I am too cautious, that I am costing them wages by slowing down production. But I can live with their resentment better than I could live with their deaths. Julia found herself admiring this quality in him, this willingness to do what was right even when it was unpopular. In her experience, most men chose the path that benefited themselves, regardless of who got hurt in the process. A week passed, then two, and Julia began to relax into her new life. She took over most of the cooking and housework, not because Lucas demanded it, but because it gave her a sense of purpose. She cleaned the house from top to bottom, organized the shelves, mended clothes that had been neglected. She baked bread and pies, made preserves from the wild berries that grew in the hills, and started planning improvements to the garden. Lucas worked long hours at the mine, but always came home in time for dinner. He would wash at the pump outside, changing out of his work clothes before entering the house, and then he would sit with Julia while she told him about her day. He listened with genuine interest when she talked about the garden or the book she was reading from his collection, and sometimes he would share stories about his men or challenges at the mine. They were becoming friends, Julia realized with some surprise. She had not expected that from this arrangement, had not thought it was possible to genuinely like the man she had married sight unseen. But friendship, she was learning, brought its own complications. She found herself noticing things about Lucas that had nothing to do with safety or survival. The way his hair curled at the nape of his neck, the strength in his hands when he split wood, the rare smile that transformed his serious face into something warm and open. She would catch herself watching him sometimes, wondering what it would be like to truly be his wife in every sense of the word. These thoughts frightened her because they meant vulnerability, meant giving him power over more than just her physical safety. Julia had learned long ago that desire was dangerous, that letting someone close enough to touch your heart meant giving them the ability to destroy you. And yet, she could not seem to stop her feelings from growing. One evening in early August, a storm rolled in from the mountains, bringing with it spectacular lightning and crashing thunder. Julia stood on the porch watching the display, mesmerized by the raw power of nature. Lucas came out to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "We do not get storms like this in Boston," Julia said over the sound of the rain hammering on the roof. "Everything there feels small and contained." "The West is not small," Lucas agreed. "It demands respect." A particularly loud crack of thunder made Julia jump, and without thinking, Lucas reached out to steady her, his hand gentle on her shoulder. The touch sent electricity through her that had nothing to do with the storm, and she found herself leaning into his warmth. "Sorry," he said, starting to pull away, but Julia caught his hand. "Do not be," she said quietly. "I am not afraid of you." Lucas looked down at their joined hands, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "I am glad," he said finally. "I want you to know you can trust me, Julia. With anything." She believed him. That was the terrifying part. She believed him completely. The storm passed, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of sage and wet earth. They went inside, and Lucas built a fire in the fireplace to chase away the damp chill. Julia made hot tea, and they sat in the rocking chair and the straight-backed chair, talking about nothing in particular while the fire crackled. "Can I ask you something?" Julia said during a lull in the conversation. "Of course. Why did you really send for a mail-order bride? You said you were not good socially, but I think there is more to it than that." Lucas was quiet for so long that Julia thought he might not answer. Then he set down his teacup and stared into the fire. "I tried courting the normal way," he said. 3 years ago there was a woman in town, Margaret Hamilton. She was pretty and kind, and I thought perhaps she could care for me. I worked up the courage to ask if I could call on her, and she said yes." He paused, his jaw tight. "For 3 months I did everything right. I brought her flowers, took her to church socials, talked with her father about my prospects. And then one day I came home from the mine with my hands torn up from pulling a man out of a collapsed tunnel. Margaret saw the blood and the dirt, and she looked at me like I was something disgusting. She told me she could not marry someone who worked with his hands like a common laborer, that she had hoped I would move into management and become respectable." Julia felt anger kindle in her chest. "She was a fool." "Maybe," Lucas said. "But it made me realize that I did not want to spend my life trying to be something I am not. I like working in the mine. I like being with my men, solving problems with my hands as well as my mind. I need someone who can accept that, who would not try to change me into something more socially acceptable." "I understand that," Julia said softly. "I spent years trying to be invisible, trying not to provoke attention. It is exhausting to constantly pretend." "We do not have to pretend with each other," Lucas said, looking at her directly. "That was the whole point of this arrangement." "I know," Julia said, "and I am grateful for it, more grateful than I can express." Something shifted between them in that moment, some invisible barrier dissolving. When they said good night and retreated to their separate sleeping spaces, Julia lay awake for a long time, thinking about the man in the next room and the life they were building together. The following Sunday, Lucas asked if Julia would like to attend church services in town. She had been avoiding social situations, not ready to face the scrutiny of the townspeople, but she could not hide forever. She put on her best dress, a modest brown affair with a white collar, and pinned up her hair with extra care. They rode into town in the wagon, and Julia tried not to be nervous about meeting people as Lucas's wife. But her worries proved mostly unfounded. The townspeople were curious but kind, greeting her with genuine warmth. Martha from the restaurant insisted on introducing Julia to her daughter and daughter-in-law, and several other women welcomed her to Park City with invitations to visit. After the service, Reverend Martin pulled them aside. "Lucas, I wanted to speak with you about the school situation." "What about it?" Lucas asked. "Miss Perry, our teacher, is getting married and moving to California. We need to find a replacement before the fall term begins, but it is proving difficult. Not many educated women want to come to a mining town." The Reverend looked at Julia thoughtfully. "I do not suppose you have teaching experience, Mrs. Oleander." Julia felt her heart skip. "I never formally taught," she said slowly. "But I helped educate the younger workers at the factory in Boston. Many of them could not read or write when they arrived." "That is more experience than most," Reverend Martin said eagerly. "Would you consider taking the position? We cannot pay much, but we can offer $50 a month and the use of the schoolhouse." Julia looked at Lucas, uncertain. They had not discussed her working outside the home. Some men would see it as shameful, a sign that they could not provide adequately, but Lucas was nodding. "If Julia wants to teach, she should teach. She does not need my permission to make that decision." "I would like to try," Julia heard herself saying, "if you think I am qualified." "We would be grateful to have you," the Reverend said, shaking her hand enthusiastically. "The children are desperate for good instruction." As they drove home that afternoon, Julia felt lighter than she had in years. The prospect of teaching, of having meaningful work beyond housekeeping, filled her with excitement. "Thank you for not objecting," she told Lucas. "Why would I object?" he asked, genuinely confused. "You have a skill that the community needs and you should use it. Besides, I think you will be an excellent teacher. You barely know me." "I know enough," Lucas said. "I know you are patient and intelligent and kind. Those are the qualities that matter in a teacher." Julia felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. Lucas had a way of seeing the best in her, of believing in her capabilities even when she doubted herself. The next few weeks were busy as Julia prepared to take over the schoolhouse. She met with Miss Perry to understand the curriculum and the needs of the various students, who ranged from 6-year-old beginners to 14-year-old minors' children who attended sporadically between work shifts. She organized the classroom, ordered books and supplies from the general store, and developed lesson plans that would accommodate the different skill levels. Lucas supported her efforts completely, building new shelves for the schoolhouse and repairing desks that had been damaged. In the evenings, he would listen as she practiced lessons aloud, offering encouragement and occasionally asking questions that helped her refine her approach. The first day of school arrived in early September, and Julia stood in front of 23 children with her heart pounding. But as soon as she began teaching, the nervousness faded. She loved the work immediately, loved the curiosity in the children's eyes, the satisfaction of watching understanding dawn on a young face. The hours flew by, and when she dismissed the students at 3 o'clock, she felt energized rather than exhausted. Lucas was waiting outside the schoolhouse with the wagon, and his face brightened when he saw her expression. "It went well. It was wonderful," Julia said, climbing up beside him. "Challenging but wonderful. I think I can really help these children." "I have no doubt," Lucas said, and the pride in his voice made her glow. As autumn settled over Park City, Julia found herself genuinely happy for the first time in her adult life. She had meaningful work, a comfortable home, and a partner who respected her. The fear that had been her constant companion for so many years had faded to a distant echo, something she could almost forget during the busy days. But happiness brought vulnerability, and vulnerability brought risk. Julia was falling in love with her husband, and she had no idea if he felt the same way. They lived together companionably, worked together smoothly, but Lucas still slept on his cot in the main room and had never pushed for more than friendship. Sometimes she would catch him looking at her with an expression she could not quite read, something that might have been longing or might have been her imagination. One evening in mid-October, Julia decided to take a risk. She had made Lucas's favorite dinner, pot roast with vegetables, and after they finished eating, she did not immediately begin clearing the dishes. Instead, she stayed seated, gathering her courage. "Lucas," she said, "can we talk about our arrangement?" He looked up from his coffee, instantly alert. "Of course. Is something wrong?" "No," Julia said quickly. "Nothing is wrong, but I have been thinking about our marriage, about how you said things could change when I was ready." Understanding dawned in Lucas's eyes, followed by something that looked like hope. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly. "I think so," Julia said, her heart racing. "I want to be a real wife to you, Lucas, not just in name but in truth." Lucas reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I want that too," he admitted. "I have wanted it for weeks now, but I needed you to come to it on your own without pressure." "I am still afraid," Julia confessed. "I do not know how to do this, how to be intimate without fear." "We will figure it out together," Lucas said. "We will go slowly and you can stop me at any time. I will never hurt you, Julia. That is a promise." They stood, and Lucas led her to the bedroom, moving with deliberate slowness to give her time to change her mind. But Julia did not want to change her mind. She wanted this man, wanted to bridge the final distance between them. What happened next was tender and careful, with Lucas guiding her through each step and constantly checking that she was all right. When Julia flinched at certain touches, he adjusted, finding ways to bring her pleasure without triggering her trauma. It was not perfect or effortless, but it was honest and full of care, and when they finally came together completely, Julia felt something break open inside her, some last wall crumbling. Afterwards, they lay tangled together in the big bed, Lucas's arms wrapped protectively around her. Julia pressed her face against his chest and let herself cry, releasing years of pent-up pain and fear. Lucas held her through it all, his hands stroking her hair, his voice murmuring reassurances. "I love you," he said into the darkness. "I think I have loved you since you stepped off that stagecoach looking so frightened and brave. I know we married as strangers, but you have become everything to me." "I love you too," Julia whispered back. "I did not think I could feel this way, did not think I deserved it. But you have shown me what gentleness looks like, what true strength is." They talked late into the night, sharing secrets and dreams, planning a future that felt real and possible. When they finally fell asleep, it was in each other's arms, and Julia felt safer than she had ever felt in her life. The weeks that followed were the happiest Julia had known. She and Lucas were truly partners now in every sense, sharing not just their home and work but their hearts. They made love often, and each time, Julia found herself relaxing more, trusting more deeply. Lucas was patient with her remaining anxieties, creative in finding ways to bring her joy, and Julia discovered that intimacy did not have to be frightening when it was built on respect and genuine affection. Her teaching continued to flourish. The children adored her, and their parents frequently expressed gratitude for the education she was providing. Julia started a lending library at the schoolhouse, using books from Lucas's collection and donations from townspeople, and began offering evening classes for adults who wanted to improve their reading skills. Lucas was thriving as well. His approach to mine safety had paid off, and the Ontario mine had gone 6 months without a serious accident, a record for the area. The owner had given him a raise and increased autonomy, trusting his judgment on operational decisions. As winter approached, bringing snow to the mountains and cold winds through the valley, Julia and Lucas prepared their home for the season. They spent weekends gathering firewood, preserving food, and sealing gaps in the walls. Julia knitted socks and sweaters by the fire while Lucas read aloud from books of poetry and adventure. They were building a life together, something solid and real, and Julia marveled at how far she had come from that frightened woman on the stagecoach. In December, Julia realized she had missed her monthly courses. At first, she tried to tell herself it was just the stress of adjusting to a new life, but when a second month passed with the same result, she could no longer deny the truth. She was carrying Lucas's child. The realization brought a complicated swirl of emotions. Joy, because she wanted this baby, wanted to create a family with the man she loved. Fear, because childbirth was dangerous and children required so much care. And hope, because this baby would grow up in a home filled with love rather than violence, would never know the fear that had defined her own childhood. She told Lucas on Christmas Eve, after they had returned from a church service where candles flickered and voices rose in carols. They sat before their own fire, and Julia took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby," she said simply. Lucas's face went through a series of expressions too quick to name, finally settling on a joy so pure it made Julia's eyes sting. "A baby," he repeated, his voice filled with wonder. "We are going to be parents. Are you happy?" Julia asked, needing to hear him say it. "I am happier than I have ever been," Lucas said, pulling her close. "You have given me everything I did not know I needed, a partner, a friend, a love. And now a child. I will do everything in my power to be a good father to make sure our baby grows up safe and loved." "I know you will," Julia said, and she meant it with her whole heart. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter. Julia continued teaching until March, when her expanding belly made it difficult to stand for long periods. The townspeople were wonderful, bringing food and gifts, offering advice and support. Martha from the restaurant took it upon herself to educate Julia on what to expect during labor, sparing no details, which was both terrifying and reassuring. Lucas became even more protective, insisting that Julia rest whenever possible, taking over more of the household chores despite his long days at the mine. He built a cradle from smooth pine, sanding it until there was not a single rough edge, and painted it a soft cream color. Julia sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her hands moving rhythmically while Lucas read aloud in the evenings. In late May of 1883, as spring transformed the valley into a carpet of wildflowers, Julia went into labor. It was a long, difficult process that lasted through the night and into the next day. Lucas stayed with her the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her face with cool cloths, encouraging her through each contraction. When the midwife finally placed a squalling infant in Julia's arms, she looked down into a tiny red face and felt love so fierce it was almost painful. "A boy," the midwife announced. "A healthy, strong boy." Lucas touched the baby's tiny hand with one finger, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "He is perfect," he whispered. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names during the pregnancy but had not been able to agree. Now, looking at her son, Julia knew exactly what felt right. "Thomas," she said. "Thomas Lucas Oleander." "Thomas," Lucas repeated, testing the name. "I like it." "Welcome to the world, Thomas." The next few months were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Thomas proved to be a demanding baby, colicky and wakeful, but Julia and Lucas took shifts caring for him so both could get some rest. They worked as a team, just as they did with everything else, learning to read their son's needs and respond accordingly. Julia returned to teaching in September, bringing Thomas with her to the schoolhouse. The older students adored the baby, and Julia found that having an infant in the classroom provided unexpected teaching opportunities about responsibility and care. She rigged up a system where Thomas's cradle sat in the corner, and the children took turns rocking him when he fussed. As Thomas grew into a bright, curious toddler, Julia and Lucas discussed having more children. They both wanted a large family, wanted to fill their home with laughter and life. In the spring of 1885, Julia became pregnant again, and this time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to expect. In December, she gave birth to a daughter they named Eleanor, a tiny creature with dark curls and her father's gray eyes. Lucas proved to be as devoted a father as he was a husband. He spent his free time playing with the children, teaching Thomas to ride on Silver and showing him how to care for the animals. He sang Eleanor to sleep with old mining songs, his deep voice rumbling through the house. The children adored him, and Julia would sometimes watch them together with tears in her eyes, grateful beyond measure for the family they had built. The years passed in a blur of busy contentment. Julia continued teaching, expanding her evening programs to include practical skills like bookkeeping and basic mathematics for miners who wanted to advance. Lucas was promoted to mine supervisor, overseeing multiple shafts, and his commitment to safety standards became a model for other operations in the area. They had 3 more children over the next several years: a son named Michael in 1887, twin daughters named Catherine and Alice in 1889, and a final son named James in 1891. Their house rang with noise and chaos and joy, children racing through the rooms, filling every corner with energy. Julia's classroom remained full, and she took pride in watching her students grow and thrive. Several of the young people she had taught went on to attend university in Salt Lake City, returning with gratitude for the foundation she had given them. The lending library expanded to fill an entire wall of the schoolhouse and became a gathering place for the community. Lucas's hair began to gray at the temples, and Julia found lines appearing around her own eyes, evidence of years spent laughing and living. But they were happy lines, earned through a good life rather than carved by suffering. When they made love now, it was with the easy comfort of long familiarity, but the tenderness never faded, the care and respect that had marked their first joining still present in every touch. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Lucas took Julia to a spot high in the mountains where wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusion. They left the children with Martha for the day and rode out together on Silver and Copper, climbing until they could see the entire valley spread below them. "I never imagined this," Julia said, sitting on a flat rock with Lucas's arm around her shoulders. "When I got on that train in Boston, I was just trying to survive. I never dreamed I could be this happy." "You took a brave chance," Lucas said, "coming west to marry a stranger." "I will never stop being grateful that you did." "You made it easy," Julia said. "You showed me gentleness when I expected cruelty. You gave me room to heal and grow. You have been the best partner I could have asked for." Lucas kissed her temple. "We have built something good together," he said. A family, a life. I would not change a single thing. They sat in comfortable silence, watching clouds cast shadows across the mountains, and Julia thought about the woman she had been 10 years ago, bruised and frightened and desperate. That woman would not have believed this future was possible, would not have dared to hope for love and safety and children who laughed freely. But Julia had learned that hope was not foolish when it was built on solid ground, when it was nurtured by someone who genuinely cared. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, they rode back down the mountain together, returning to the home they had made and the children who filled it with light. Thomas, now 11, was teaching his younger siblings to play baseball in the yard, and Oleander, 8 years old, was reading a story to the twins on the porch. Michael and little James were attempting to build something with wooden blocks, their creation more enthusiasm than engineering. The children looked up as their parents rode in, and their faces brightened with joy. Julia dismounted and was immediately surrounded by small bodies demanding attention and sharing stories about their day. Lucas joined them, scooping James onto his shoulders and listening to Michael's breathless description of a bird's nest they had found. That night, after the children were all tucked into bed and the house was finally quiet, Julia and Lucas sat together on their porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. They held hands, fingers intertwined, and Julia felt peace settle over her like a blanket. "I love you," she said, not for the first time and not for the last. "I love you too," Lucas replied, his voice warm with affection. Today, tomorrow, and all the years after that. They had started as strangers joined by necessity, but had become partners bound by choice. Julia had boarded that stagecoach expecting cruelty, and had found instead a man who showed her what true gentleness looked like, what real strength meant. Together they had built a life far richer than either had imagined possible, a life filled with children and work, and the quiet joy of being truly seen and valued. The journey from Boston to Park City had changed everything. It had taken Julia from darkness into light, from fear into love. And as she sat beside her husband under the vast western sky, surrounded by the evidence of the life they had created together, Julia knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Years continued to roll past, bringing changes both expected and surprising. Thomas grew into a thoughtful young man who decided to pursue engineering rather than mining, determined to design safer systems for extracting ore. Oleander developed a passion for teaching and became Julia's assistant at the schoolhouse, showing the same patience and creativity her mother had demonstrated. Michael proved to have his father's practical skills and went to work at the mine under Lucas's supervision, learning the trade from the bottom up. The twins, Catherine and Alice, were inseparable and equally headstrong, keeping their parents constantly entertained with their schemes and adventures. James, the youngest, was a dreamer who loved books and spent hours in the lending library, reading everything he could find. The house that had once seemed spacious now felt perfectly sized for their boisterous family. Lucas had expanded it over the years, adding rooms and a second story, but it never lost its feeling of warmth and welcome. Julia maintained her garden, which had grown from a simple vegetable patch into a showcase of native flowers and herbs, a riot of color that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds. In 1895, when Julia was 35 and Lucas was 38, they sat on their porch one evening after a particularly chaotic dinner. The children had finally dispersed to their various activities, and relative quiet had descended. "You remember when it was just the two of us?" Julia asked, a smile playing at her lips. "When this house felt enormous and empty." "I remember being terrified," Lucas admitted. terrified that you would realize you had made a mistake, that you would want to leave. I thought the same thing about you, Julia said. I kept waiting for the mask to slip, for the cruelty to emerge. Instead, we just kept being ourselves, Lucas said. And it was enough. It was more than enough, Julia corrected. It was everything. They watched the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, and Julia reflected on how much her life had changed since that July day in 1882, when she had stepped off the stagecoach with nothing but fear and desperate hope. She had been prepared for the worst and had received the best, a partner who valued her, children who thrived, work that mattered, and a community that had embraced her. In 1898, Thomas graduated from engineering school and returned to Park City with innovative ideas about mine safety. He and Lucas spent hours discussing designs for better ventilation systems and more effective shoring techniques. Eventually, the mine owner agreed to implement several of Thomas's proposals, and accident rates dropped even further. Father and son worked together, combining Lucas's practical experience with Thomas's theoretical knowledge, and the Ontario mine became known throughout the territory for its progressive approach. Oleander took over Julia's teaching position when Julia decided to focus on the adult education programs full-time. Mother and daughter continued to collaborate, and the schoolhouse flourished under their joint stewardship. Oleander showed particular skill in reaching struggling students, finding creative ways to help them grasp difficult concepts. The twins, Catherine and Alice, caused a minor scandal when they announced at 18 that they wanted to attend normal school and become teachers themselves, but in Denver rather than staying in Park City. Julia and Lucas supported their decision despite raised eyebrows from more traditional townspeople. The girls left together in 1907, full of excitement and determination, promising to write regularly. Michael, solid and dependable like his father, married a local girl named Sarah in 1900 and began building a house on the far side of Lucas and Julia's property. Their first grandchild, a daughter they named Julia, arrived in 1901, and Julia held the tiny infant with tears streaming down her face, marveling at the continuation of their family line. James pursued his love of books by becoming a journalist, writing articles about mining communities for newspapers in Salt Lake City and Denver. His pieces often featured his father's innovations and his mother's educational programs, bringing recognition to the family's work. As the new century progressed, Lucas and Julia settled into the comfortable rhythms of middle age. Their hair was more gray than brown now, and they moved with slightly less speed than they once had, but their love remained constant. They still took walks together in the evenings when weather permitted, still sat up late talking about everything and nothing, still reached for each other in the night. In 1910, on a particularly warm spring day, Lucas came home from the mine looking tired. Julia noticed but said nothing, simply ensured he ate a good dinner and rested properly. But when the fatigue persisted for weeks, she insisted he see the doctor in town. The diagnosis was heart strain, likely from years of physical labor, and the doctor advised Lucas to retire from mining work. Lucas struggled with this at first. He was only 53, still felt capable, and mining had been his entire adult life. But Julia reminded him of all the other things he could do with his time, all the projects he had been putting off. Thomas was fully capable of overseeing the safety programs, and Michael could manage the day-to-day operations. "You have given 30 years to that mine," Julia said firmly. "You have earned the right to rest." So Lucas retired, and to his surprise, he found that he enjoyed having more time. He built furniture in a workshop he set up in the barn, creating beautiful pieces from local wood. He helped Julia with her adult education programs, teaching mathematics and practical engineering concepts. He spent long hours with his grandchildren, passing down stories and skills. And he had more time with Julia, which was the greatest gift of all. They traveled some during these years, taking the train to San Francisco and once all the way to Chicago. But they always came back to Park City, to the home they had built and the life they loved. The town had changed considerably since Julia's arrival in 1882, growing larger and more prosperous, but the sense of community remained strong. In 1915, the town threw a celebration for Lucas and Julia's 33rd wedding anniversary. It was a surprise, organized by their children and grandchildren, and featured speeches from former students, mine workers Lucas had mentored, and townspeople whose lives they had touched. Julia stood beside her husband, holding his hand, and felt overwhelmed by the evidence of the impact they had made together. "We just lived our lives," she whispered to Lucas as person after person shared stories of kindness and help. "We lived them well," Lucas replied. "That matters." The Great War came and went, touching even their small mining town as young men went off to fight. James enlisted as a correspondent, sending back dispatches that appeared in newspapers across the country. Thomas's engineering skills were put to use designing equipment for the war effort. Julia and Oleander organized relief efforts, collecting supplies and writing letters to soldiers. The family survived the war intact, though changed by it, grateful when peace finally came. In the 1920s, as they moved into their 60s, Lucas and Julia began to slow down. They handed over more responsibilities to their children, content to play the role of advisors rather than leaders. They spent their days in simple pleasures, tending the garden, reading together, entertaining grandchildren who now numbered 8 and great-grandchildren who were beginning to arrive. On their 50th wedding anniversary in 1932, the entire family gathered at the house, 3 generations filling every room and spilling out into the yard. Thomas and Oleander had organized everything, and as the sun set, they all gathered around to hear Lucas and Julia share the story of how they met. "I got off a stagecoach expecting a tyrant," Julia said, her voice still strong despite her 72 years. "I had resigned myself to a life of fear and servitude. Instead, I found a partner who showed me what love could be. I sent for a mail-order bride expecting someone to cook and clean," Lucas added, his arm around Julia's shoulders. "Instead, I found my best friend, the mother of my children, the center of my world." "How did you know it would work?" one of the great-grandchildren asked. "How did you know you would be happy?" Julia and Lucas looked at each other, and in that glance was 50 years of shared history, of joys and sorrows weathered together. "We did not know," Julia said honestly, "but we were willing to try. We were willing to be gentle with each other, to build trust slowly, to believe that something good was possible. And we never stopped choosing each other," Lucas added. "Every day we chose this marriage, this life. That is the secret if there is one." The celebration continued late into the night, with music and dancing, and so much laughter that Julia thought her heart might burst from happiness. She looked around at all these people, this family that had grown from a terrified woman and a lonely man who had taken a chance on each other, and felt profoundly grateful for every moment that had brought them to this point. As the years continued, Lucas's heart grew weaker despite the best care available. He moved more slowly, tired more easily, but his mind remained sharp, and his love for Julia never wavered. They spent their days sitting together, reminiscing about the past and marveling at the family they had created. In the spring of 1937, As wildflowers once again carpeted the mountains, Lucas suffered a major heart attack. The doctor was called and the family gathered, but they all knew the end was near. Julia sat beside the bed, holding Lucas's hand, their children and grandchildren surrounding them. "I am not afraid," Lucas told her, his voice weak but clear. "I have lived a good life, Julia. The best life, because you were in it." "Do not leave me," Julia whispered, even though she knew it was selfish. "I will never really leave," Lucas said. "I will be in this house we built together, in our children and grandchildren, in the mountains and the garden and every memory we made. You will carry me with you." He died peacefully that evening, with Julia's hand in his, surrounded by love. The town mourned his passing, recognizing that they had lost a man who had made their community better through his quiet integrity and commitment to doing what was right. Julia grieved deeply, but not hopelessly. She had loved Lucas for 55 years, and she would carry that love for whatever time remained to her. She stayed in their house, surrounded by children and grandchildren who made sure she was never alone. She continued her work with the adult education programs as long as she was able, finding purpose in service as she always had. In her final years, Julia would sit on the porch Lucas had built, looking out at the garden they had planted together, and remember. She remembered the frightened young woman who had stepped off a stagecoach, expecting cruelty. She remembered the quiet man who had shown her gentleness instead. She remembered a lifetime of moments, both ordinary and extraordinary, that had woven together into something beautiful. Julia Catherine Oleander passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1942 at the age of 82, surrounded by family in the house where she had found safety and built a life. She was laid to rest beside Lucas under the wide Utah sky, their headstones side by side just as they had been in life. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren carried forward the legacy of gentleness and integrity they had modeled. The schoolhouse Julia had taught in for so many years was eventually named in her honor, and a plaque was placed at the Ontario mine commemorating Lucas's contributions to worker safety. But their real legacy was not in buildings or plaques. It was in the lives they had touched, the love they had shared, the proof that even in the hardest circumstances, kindness and courage could create something lasting and good. The house stood for many more years, occupied by descendants who filled it with new generations of laughter and love. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind whispered through the valley, it almost seemed like you could still feel their presence there, Lucas and Julia, the mail-order bride and the cowboy who had found in each other everything they had never dared to hope for. Two souls who had transformed a desperate arrangement into a love story that would echo through the generations.